Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all my friends at Smith Ranch. I'm glad to be with you again. I'm Aryeh Green, as you may know, and I'm delighted to be speaking with you again from my home here in Israel about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and I believe also of great interest to many of you as well. Um, I know, of course, many of you and have enjoyed getting to know you over the years, and we've had interesting discussions sometimes around the breakfast table or in the lobby lounge or otherwise, or in the talks that I've given in the community over the years about a lot of different ideas, both related to Israel and our history and politics, related to my hike on the Israel National Trail, meeting personal challenges, and the like. And my most recent talk with you was about the Jewish sources, the biblical sources of modern political, well, in the Western world, political democratic human rights theory. Those bases from the Hebrew Bible, from Judaic sources in the Middle Ages, and up to modern recognition by Thomas Jefferson, Rousseau, Kant, Hobbes, and many others of the debt owed or the gratitude for the basis of what we consider modern human rights theory. So that was the topic of our last talk. And today I've been asked to go a little bit deeper into a more practical application of the discussion of human rights. Today, of course, as you know, democracy, human rights, civil rights, political rights, these are words that are used frequently in domestic contexts and also in terms of trying to evaluate and establish different foreign policy objectives for the United States, for Europe, for the rest of the democratic world. But we run up against a real problem, a challenge, often, I think, in the last 10, 20, 30 years. In fact, even if you go back 100 years, Woodrow Wilson talking about making the world safe for democracy, and the movements after World War I and World War II of establishing new countries, new national entities, states in Europe, in Africa, South America, and Asia, and of course also in the Middle East, where one of the biggest discussions was how much of a right or even a capability should the Western world, the democratic world, the free world have in terms of trying to promote some of the ideals that we take for granted. And that has led to a situation of both a lack of moral clarity, a lack of understanding, I think, of some of the basic definitions of what we mean when we use terms like human rights, democracy, freedom, liberty, and the like. So today we're going to have a discussion about democracy, about definitions, about demonization also, because when we titled this talk the freedom, democracy, and human rights in the Middle East, and we're going to talk a lot about Israel, and we're going to talk a lot about the countries around Israel, the rest of the Middle East. Arab, mostly Arab. Iran, of course, is Persian and not Arabic. Turkey is Turkish, with a long history with the Ottoman Empire, as independent from the Arab world and yet also Muslim, like Iran and the majority of those 22 Arab states in the Middle East. So we're going to talk about a number of general principles and then apply them to how we can think about some of the goals that we in the West, I would say, should be, ought to be, could be pursuing when it comes to these issues of human rights and democracy and freedom in the Middle East that are bandied about so casually, I think, over the last decade or two, when it comes to both American foreign policy, European policy, and of course the whole issue of the Arab-Israel conflict. Let's start by setting a basis of some definitions, if we can. Because the truth is, democracies are an interesting kind of example of how and whether we see these things quite as clearly as we think we do. I think most of us know the famous statement, I believe by Oliver Wendell Holmes, could be another another Supreme Court justice, about how freedom of speech has its limitations. You're not allowed to yell fire in a public theater, for the reasons being that were you to do so, you would or could cause a stampede, and people could be injured by yelling fire in a crowded theater. And that was, I think it's a good framing for the discussion that I want to have about human rights. Now, most of us in the modern world have taken a plane journey in the last decade and a half or so. And I'm sure that's true for you and members of your family and others. And there's something very interesting about plane travel today in, I would say, the last generation or so, certainly since 9/11, and for us in Israel, even prior to that. But in America, when you get on a plane, you take a few things for granted. In fact, I remember at one point, a number of years ago, at least a decade ago, I was giving a talk in Cleveland, Ohio. And after the talk, I went to the airport to take a plane, and I was checking in at the check-in counter. And the man next to me at the counter next started to have an argument with the woman who was trying to check him in. She was asking him some questions. Who packed your bag? Where did you come from to get to the airport? Where are you going? The purpose of your trip? Has that bag been with you at all times? And he was getting a little bit hot under the collar. He didn't want to answer any of the questions. And I complimented her afterwards for her poise, didn't get ruffled, said to him, "Sir, I'm required to ask you these questions. You are free not to answer them. And you are free to drive or walk or take a train or take a bus or find another means of transportation to get to your destination. But if you want to fly with us, I need you to answer these questions." And I found that exchange enlightening, illuminating, especially with regard to our topic, because we do take some things for granted today. You go through the security checkpoint, as it were, in the airport, and sometimes they'll open your bags. And opening your bag is a real invasion of your privacy. It's much more so than just asking those questions. And we in America and in the West in general take the right of privacy, the right to privacy, as sacrosanct. We have the whole issue in our Constitution about illegal search and warrant, search and seizure. You don't have to let a policeman search your car unless he has cause to do so. And the same thing in terms of getting a warrant for public security officials to come into your home, to look into your belongings. So why is that? Why is it that when we go to an airport, we allow some of our freedoms to be abused, as it were, or to be denied? And the answer, I think, is intuitively very clear. Yes, we have a right to privacy. Yes, we have a right to congregate. Yes, we have a right to a freedom of movement. But it raises a very interesting issue. We have another right, and the public has another right, which supersedes all these other rights that we take for granted. And what is that right? The right not to be blown up in the middle of the air in an airplane. The right to life. In other words, we accept the limitations on our freedoms, on our privacy, these incursions or invasion of our privacy, we accept because we want to stay alive. And we accept and we understand that we, as a society, as a free society, in order to maintain that free society, have to sometimes abridge or restrict the freedoms that we take for granted. And by the way, I'm recording this in the midst of our corona situation, where, of course, you there in America, we here in Israel and elsewhere across the world, our freedom of movement has been tremendously limited. And we accept that. We accept the restrictions on freedom of assembly, on our freedom of movement, and to a certain extent our right to privacy, which of course now is a very big issue about the apps, the software, which is being used to monitor our movements to indicate for our own benefit if we've been exposed to somebody who's a carrier of the coronavirus. And yet, we're balancing, and these are public, obviously, debates about how we can balance the right to privacy and freedom of assembly and movement with the right and the responsibility by the government for public safety and preservation of life. But the point that I'm really making is that democracies do pursue policies that restrict freedoms and freedom of movement, etc. But that doesn't mean that we are somehow either violating the human rights of our citizens or others under our authority. Certainly not that we are the grossest violator of human rights in the world. I mean, that's one of the biggest issues I think that I as an Israeli have come up against over the last quarter of a century or more. And that is when you go to a college campus or sometimes in church groups, in synagogue groups, among the Muslim community, and of course within the context of politics, different political echelons, trade unions and others, there are repeated refrains about how Israel is the grossest violator of human rights on the planet, which, as you'll see as we get into this a little bit more, is not just hyperbole. It's actually turning on its head a definition that we should recognize and adopt and use in our public discourse of what we mean when we say human rights and what is a human rights violation. When I was working with Natan Sharansky, who is one of the leaders of the human rights movement in the former Soviet Union in the 70s and the 80s, we visited over 150 college campuses, and Israel was attacked all the time on college campuses. Especially on college campuses, also in the media and elsewhere, as a violator of human rights with our defensive military operations, with our mere presence in the disputed territories of Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank of the Jordan River. And what's important to understand is throughout my comments that I want to share with you today, of course I care. So does Mr. Sharansky. So do most Israelis, including our leaders. We care about the suffering of individual Palestinians, those who self-identify, those Arab, Muslims, Christians, others who self-identify as Palestinian. We care about their suffering, the economic suffering that they may be undergoing because of our defensive military operations or our need to build a security barrier to stop those few among them who have been interested in getting into our civilian populations to carry out acts of terror. And of course, the personal suffering that is part and parcel of being, I would say, a pawn in a political conflict that's gone on far too long. But what's important to recognize is that, no, Israel actually has an excellent record when it comes to human rights, civil rights, personal rights, and the like. And we'll talk about that in a little bit to give a few examples, I think. I mean, you might think this is a bit of a chutzpah to say that Israel is a champion of human rights, but it's actually true. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and I think many of you know that. But we have to understand what that means. It doesn't only mean that Israel is a multicultural society where Arabs, Muslims, Christians, Druze, Jews, of course, Bedouin, Circassians, Ethiopian immigrants, former Russian Soviet immigrants, and others live freely in a society where there is freedom of speech, freedom of the press, religious rights, minority rights, gay rights, women's rights, and the like. That's not the only point. It applies also to Israel's behavior in the disputed territories since we regained control over those territories in 1967. The complexity of the issues really comes down to a question of the definitions. What do we mean when we say human rights? What do we mean when we talk about freedom? And understanding this is an important part, I think, of our public discourse. And so I want to take a few minutes to actually go into a little bit more detail what these definitions are. So first of all, to understand, this is not a political discussion, and it's an important kind of side comment to make about where I'm going here. This is not about politics. This is not to address the question which we have discussed, with many of you over the years, whether or not those Arabs who self-identify as quote-unquote Palestinians deserve or should be recognized or deserve to have an independent political entity or a state in whatever borders or territory might be established. That's not what we're talking about here. That is a political issue which reasonable people can argue that the 70% of mandatory Palestine, which is across the Jordan River, today's present-day Jordan, of whose citizens, 70% of whose citizens are self-identified as Palestinians, whether that should be a Palestinian state, whether that should be the Arab state envisioned in the 1947 partition plan, or whether perhaps some of those areas now known as Judea and Samaria, as the West Bank of the Jordan River, as it's called, now administered by the Palestinian Authority that was set up as a result of the Oslo process, whether or not that should be turned into some sort of a state with some elements of independence. Reasonable people can argue whether or not those two options are worth pursuing. The Trump administration, and before it the Barack Obama administration, and before it the Bush administration, and others have had lots of ideas going back to Jimmy Carter, and even before the Rogers Plan under President Nixon, President Johnson. Many people have had many ideas of how we can resolve the Arab-Israel conflict and find a way for those who self-identify as Palestinians to express that identity. And reasonable people can argue whether Israel should or shouldn't apply its sovereignty to the territories, the biblical heartland of those hills of Judea and Samaria, north and south of Jerusalem, overlooking the coastal plain that is the pre-1967 Israeli areas. Reasonable people can argue these points. That's not our topic here. Our topic today is to look at how we define human rights within the context of the accusations made against Israel as being a gross violator of human rights, and to understand if we really care about human rights, which we'll define shortly, where our attention should be focused if we're looking to promote freedom and democracy and human rights in the Middle East. So Natan Sharansky has written a wonderful book called The Case for Democracy, which I highly recommend. You should have in your library. And in it, he describes something that he used to call the town square test. One of the main foundations of an understanding of what we mean when we talk about democracy and rights. And that test is very simple. Can you, as a resident of a particular society, go into the town square and vocally, loudly, either with a sign, a plaque, or a placard, or with your voice and a loudspeaker, can you criticize your government? If you can criticize your government, and the town square is also a metaphor, it could be in the newspaper, it could be on Facebook or what have you. If you can criticize your government, if you have that freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, then you're living in a free society. And if you don't, if you're afraid of being reprimanded, fined, imprisoned, beaten up, tried, and thrown into jail or into the gulag as it was in the Soviet Union, then you're not living in a free society. You're living in what Mr. Sharansky called a fear society. And the difference between a free society and a fear society can be understood within the context of this town square test, because freedom of speech, freedom of conscience is one of the foundations of what we would consider a free society. Because freedom of speech implies a free press. It implies the freedom of religion in terms of expressing your religion and so many other issues. So when we talk about rights, human rights, civil rights, personal rights, that's really what we're talking about. The freedom of conscience and freedom of speech that then leads to other civil rights and important human rights. Women's rights, just for instance, gay rights, other minority rights, the questions of freedom of religion, as I mentioned, and freedom of the press. This is the conceptual framework within which we have to evaluate both Israel's behavior in its defensive military operations and its administration of the disputed territories, and the behavior of the societies, the rest of the societies in the Middle East. Aside from the issue of the Arab Israelis as a minority in Israel who have all rights within the context of Israel as a democratic society, just as minorities in Britain or France or Germany or America have, what we want to look at is also some of the issues within the wider context. But let's stop for a second and acknowledge something. Because again, as I said, we're not talking politics here, but I know that many of you read or have heard or listen or watch on television various different criticisms of Israel as a country. And unfortunately, we don't hear similar criticisms of those countries around us where the criticisms are in fact much more justified. Let's take, for instance, this issue of discrimination against Arab Israelis. There is discrimination in Israel. There is discrimination against all sorts of minorities. In some ways, there's discrimination of people like me who immigrated from other countries and are treated, and I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, as second-class citizens in the sense that we're made fun of because of our accents. And there are other minorities that are discriminated against, and I'm using the word casually. In Israel. Jews who came from Ethiopia, Jews who came from the Soviet Union, Jews who came from Yemen, have been discriminated against in the past because the ruling elites of Israel for many, many years came from European roots. And so it's in that context, and another context, that I'd like to address the issue of discrimination which does exist against Arab Israelis. The other context is this. You may be familiar within the context of California or American society or British or French or German society that all of us as democracies face a challenge when it comes to how equally and fairly we treat our minorities. Now, I'm not talking about racism because racism to a great extent, thank God, is no longer prevalent in American or British or Israeli or French or German society. We don't look down on others, whoever we are. We could be black, Chinese, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise, and we don't look at others as inferior or less intelligent or less capable or subhuman or the like. Of course not. But there is some endemic discrimination within our Western societies, which is partially economic and partially social, and also relates to language issues and fluency and what have you. Now, why am I saying that? Think of Latino or Hispanic Americans or African Americans or other minority groups within America who are not necessarily mistreated as second-class citizens, but who have a harder time and often come up against some different forms of discrimination. I'm not going back to earlier forms of discrimination in terms of, laws or Jim Crow laws or bylaws and condominiums in New York that didn't allow people to rent or sell their properties to different minorities, Jews, blacks, or others. I'm talking about even today, the fact that there is a certain element of social, cultural, discriminatory behavior which we recognize. Now, why am I taking so much time to go into that? Because in recognizing it, we obviously, as a society, most of us, with a sense of a moral imperative to create a free society, which if you were part of our earlier discussion about the biblical roots of modern democratic Western political theory, is one of the bases of our, at least our aspirations as a society, to provide dignity to the human being and to provide equality and freedom and equality of opportunity and equality of treatment under the law to all citizens. But my point is this: if you're a Hispanic American or an African American, and I want to widen our lens a bit, if you're a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi in Britain, if you're an Algerian or a Tunisian in France, if you're a Turkish immigrant but a civilian, a citizen in Germany, you suffer similar discrimination. Not systemic on the part of the government, but social and cultural and perhaps economic. And these are challenges which all of us as democracies are facing. And Israel is in the same boat. We have a challenge which we address in our education system and in our media and in our political echelon to ensure freedom and fair treatment and equality for our Arab Israel minorities. We haven't yet achieved that equality yet. And so when you acknowledge that there is some discrimination against Arab Israelis, what's important to recognize is it's no worse. It's probably actually better than the discrimination that exists in America against African Americans or Hispanic Americans, or as I said, in Britain against Pakistanis, or France and their Algerian minority, or Germany and their Turkish minority. That's putting things in context. And in fact, when I say it's even better, I think it's important to recognize, many of you know that in Israel, there are Arab Muslims and Arab Christians who serve on the Supreme Court, who of course serve in our parliament, the Knesset, who are business leaders, who are doctors and nurses and are treated as equals as such, especially in this age of Corona, and recognized as such and applauded and with gratitude expressed. Including, by the way, in our National Independence Day celebrations, where every year different citizens are called upon to light a flame at the beginning of our Independence Day ceremonies, and often an Arab Israeli, a Muslim, or Druze, member of the Druze community, or a Bedouin, or an Arab Christian is asked to do so, and of course, patients in our hospitals are treated entirely equally. My wife gave birth in 2 different Jerusalem hospitals in 3 different times in a Jerusalem hospital with Arab Muslim women in the bed next to her, which is not an unusual situation. So I took a little bit of extra time to go into detail there about the issue of how we define discrimination and whether or not we can believe. I mean, the word apartheid is a word that I never use in a sentence when I'm talking about the country that I live in and that we're discussing here today. And there's a reason, because the accusation that Israel somehow discriminates against its Arab Muslim minorities, either in the country or in its treatment of those who self-identify as Palestinian in the disputed territories, is such an absurdity when you understand the reality both on the ground and when you understand the definitions that we're discussing now. The only country in the Middle East, if we talk about the town square test, where an Arab Muslim can freely criticize their government, whether they're a citizen of the country, meaning an Arab Israeli, or whether they're a Palestinian resident in the disputed territories, in the parliament or on television or on Facebook or in the town square, the only country in the Middle East where that's true is the Jewish, democratic, free state of Israel. And I can't emphasize that enough. You're not going to get shot or tortured or jailed for criticizing the Israeli government anywhere where that Israeli government has authority, in the territories or in Israel proper. I mean, these are progressive values, and it's important to recognize that. Look around our neighborhood: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Yemen, Iran, Algeria, Tunisia. These are countries in various stages, I hope, of developing more and more open and free societies, but most of those that I just mentioned are not examples of free societies. They're rated by Freedom House, which is the leading, I would say, evaluator, leading think tank that evaluates and analyzes the level of freedoms in societies around the world. They routinely, year after year, list all the countries that I just mentioned as either not free, most of them, or partially free. That would be Lebanon and Jordan, because there is a little bit more of a modicum of actual elected representative democracy. But it's not even democracy, because there's no freedom of speech. The Mukhbarat, the secret police in Jordan, are one of the most feared in the region. You're talking about societies where it's not just a question of women's rights, where women's freedom is limited. Saudi Arabia, where a woman can't drive. Now they can learn to drive. That's a new development, thankfully, and we can recognize that. But women aren't allowed to travel without the accompaniment of their husband, father, uncle, or even young son. And women are discriminated against in various formats. There's no freedom of religion. In Saudi Arabia, it's illegal to be and to practice Judaism, Christianity, or other religions. And I mean that in terms of even in the privacy of your own home, not just a question of that there are no churches or synagogues in Saudi Arabia. Yemen, Egypt, Lebanon are areas where freedom of speech just virtually doesn't exist. And the Palestinian Authority, which unfortunately rules the lives of 99% of those who self-identify as Palestinian there in the territories, is one of the most notorious restrictors of speech and freedom of assembly. There are Palestinians who have been imprisoned for Facebook posts which criticize Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and the Palestinian Authority. There are examples, numerous examples of people who've been beat up for criticizing the government. There are situations, you want to talk about gay rights. I was personally involved in achieving refugee status for a number of Palestinian gay men who found themselves persecuted for being gay in the Palestinian society, including by the authorities, by the police. Christians who have been in Bethlehem, which was in 1997 65% Christian, the government and the city of Bethlehem, which came then under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, it is now 15% Christian, 85% Muslim. The town of Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. Why is that? Because of systematic persecution of Christians, both in terms of their religious freedoms, their ability to worship, as well as social, political, and economic pressure being brought to bear on them, including rocks thrown through the storefronts, the windows of Christian businesses, including Christians being assaulted on the street for eating during the day on the Muslim festival of Ramadan, which we're in the middle of now in terms of a month of daily fasting. It's important that we should know, we all should recognize this. Now, I'm not dissing, I guess I am criticizing, of course I am criticizing these societies throughout the Middle East because they are not free. But I'm not suggesting that makes America or France or Israel necessarily better as a society. It's okay, of course, it's reasonable to want to have a Muslim or traditional or Middle Eastern society. We don't need the world to be made in our image. But I think what we have to understand is this. After World War II, when the Allies, the victorious Allies, made a policy decision to not just encourage, but in fact to coerce the societies in Japan and Germany to give up on their militaristic, racist, xenophobic social milieu and policies, and to develop a more free and liberal and tolerant society, and to create a democratic structure that would support those kind of freedoms. It was done without pressuring these societies to become necessarily like France, like America, like Britain, or what have you. Japan is a very good example. An Eastern culture with its own religious tradition and heritage. It's still a relatively hierarchical society. One might even say misogynist, but I don't want to go that far. Certainly traditional and hierarchical, but with very strong democratic institutions promoting the freedoms that we've been discussing today. That is a reasonable goal to have for the other countries in the Middle East. Meaning, we can criticize Israel's policies in the territories in its defensive military operations if one wishes to see and one wants to suggest that Israel should have used other means to protect the lives of its citizens. It shouldn't have built a security barrier. It should have done something else. It shouldn't have gone into Gaza in order to stop the rocket fire. It should have done something else. Reasonable people can debate policy issues, but to suggest that Israel's defensive military operations make it the grossest violator of human rights in the world, that is going too far. Because just as we accept the necessity for going through security checkpoints in airports, we can understand the necessity for Israel to set up a security checkpoint to stop those individuals, those extremists and terrorists who are interested in causing havoc and injury, death and maiming to Israeli civilians. And by the way, not just Israelis. Visitors also have been injured in terror attacks, and of course not just Jews, Christians, Muslims, Arabs, and others, but mostly Israelis and mostly Jews. And the point is that restricting those freedoms of movements, freedom of assembly or the like, is hardly a sign of a gross violation of human rights as much as it is a sign of the modern era that we live in, where even democracies are forced, unfortunately, to restrict some of those liberties that we take for granted. So, I think what's important is to recognize the balance between the progressive values that we all share and the application of the principles that we want to promote to the countries of the Middle East. We can support gay rights, women's rights, minority rights, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, democracy, electoral democracy, and parliamentary democracy, and all of these freedoms and concepts that we take for granted, and at the same time support Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, support Israel's right to exist as well as its right to defend itself, and support those forces within the Arab and Muslim world throughout the Middle East who are also working to promote those same values that we're discussing here. You should know some of these names, just to give a few examples. In Kuwait, Mohammed Abul Ghadir Al-Ghassan is a journalist, and he's the Secretary General of the very liberal National Democratic Alliance there in Kuwait. He's the editor of an Arab language version of Newsweek. He's the author of some 54 books, and he was arrested for criticizing the government. That's not the kind of society that we want to be seen to be allied with or to be supporting. Samar Kuda is the name of a poet, Arab Muslim poet in Jordan that you should look up or be aware of. Ayman Noor in Egypt, Sheikh Abdul Al-Hamid Al-Tamimi, who's a Syrian Sufi leader. All of these people have been imprisoned and persecuted for criticizing their government. Riyad Saif, Michel Kilo, Anwar al-Buni are all in Syria. And these people are real people. Dr. Kamil Lubwani in Syria, whose wife was denied an exit visa from Syria because of his criticism of the Syrian government. These are the kind of names, and there are more, of course, every day that we should be aware of. The journalist in the Palestinian Authority who was arrested and beaten for criticizing Muhammad Abbas that I mentioned before. We have to recognize that if we're going to be consistent in promoting our values, in promoting our way of life, in having an understanding of what are the principles that we should be pursuing in our foreign policy, and being consistent in terms of our values, we have to recognize that yes, you can criticize the policies of the Israeli government as much as you can criticize the policies of any American government or French or German. But let's also be aware that there are many policies to criticize of the Egyptian government, the Jordanian government, the Lebanese government, etc. Now, the issue here, I think, in terms of our understanding of definitions and human rights, is that human rights basically is a catch-all phrase that we have allowed to be manipulated, to be hijacked by those with a political agenda. By which I mean, there is no human right for a quote-unquote independent state. Not for the Palestinians, not for the Basques, or the Tibetans, or the Catalans, or the Scots, or the Quebecois, however you pronounce those from Quebec who want to secede from Canada. There's no latent right of independence. Political independence in the last 100 years has been just that, a political mechanism which, depending on the particular era and the contingencies or relationships between the great powers and victors of different wars or what have you, certain states, certain groupings have gained their right to independence, or not right, have gained their independence, and others haven't. Now, in the Middle East, there's one group that has a 1,000-year history as a separate culture with its own language, religious traditions, and even self-government, and those are the Kurds. And the Kurdish nation looks actually to the Jewish nation, to the people of Israel, having returned to the land of Israel, our ancestral home after 2,000 years of dispersion, the Kurds have looked to us as Jews. Jews, of course, came from Judea. I refer frequently to Jews and Judea and the people of Israel and the land of Israel to make sure that we don't have a linguistic disconnect when we look at the whole issue of the legitimacy of Israel as the modern nation state of the Jewish people. The Kurds look to the establishment of Israel and the return of the Jews to our ancestral homeland as an example of what they may be able to achieve, as do, by the way, the Tibetans. There's a whole book written about that. I think it's called The Jew and the Lotus, if I remember correctly, about how the Dalai Lama looked to the people of Israel to help understand how in a diaspora the Tibetan culture could be not just maintained, but actually increased and improved and augmented, and learning from their host cultures until they can manifest their own return to their ancient ancestral homeland and regain their independence there, as the Jews regained our sovereignty in the land of Israel. But I was saying about the Kurds are spread out across northern Iraq and western Syria, northern Syria, and eastern Turkey, and they haven't had independence now for quite some time. But if we want to promote as a political development the independence of certain people who have thousands of years of independent cultural and linguistic traditions and history, a tradition of autonomy, a connection to a particular land. So there are many of those on the planet. The Kurds, the Tibetans I mentioned, also the Basques, the Scots, the Catalans, and others. Reasonable people can argue whether or not those Arabs who self-identify as Palestinians actually are in line for their own quote-unquote right to independence, because reasonable people can evaluate the last 100 years of history in which the whole idea of a Palestinian national identity was just introduced. The earliest you could point to would be in the 1920s, and really more around the 1950s and 60s was it that the idea of an actual Palestinian national identity really developed and took hold, which was basically a result and a tactic of Nasser, of General and then President Nasser of Egypt, when he found that he couldn't actually destroy Israel militarily. But that's a topic for another time, perhaps. The point is, even if we acknowledge that the Palestinians exist today as some sort of a ethnic, cultural, call it national identity grouping, the question of whether there is a right to a Palestinian state is a non-starter. There is no such right, not in international law, not in political or democratic political theory. If there was such a right, then those who I listed before, the Basques and the Tibetans and the Kurds and the Scots, would be first in line to manifest that right. But there's no right. It's not a human right. It's a matter of, as I said, the political exigencies of any particular era that some countries have gained, some national groupings have gained their independence, and others haven't. What's important then is our understanding is that when people attack Israel for being a gross violator of human rights for its defensive military operations, or for denying the Palestinians, quote unquote, their quote right unquote to an independent state, what we're seeing is the hijacking for political purposes with an agenda of the terminology of human rights. We really have to take back this terminology. We have to, without question, promote the adoption of human rights, civil rights, personal rights, women's rights, gay rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the like, across the Middle East, if not throughout the world. And one of the points of Mr. Sharansky's book, The Case for Democracy, was and is that the Western world makes a mistake when we say, well, this is their culture. We can't interfere in Saudi Arabian internal domestic politics to ensure that women are treated with respect. That's not our business. That's not our right. The truth is, this was one of the biggest issues in the former Soviet Union, that Mr. Sharansky, based on Andrei Sakharov and other thinkers in the former Soviet Union made a very, very important point that the Western world has a right to promote these universal values of human rights. Yes, every country defines its own constitution. Every nation defines its own cultural makeup. Every country and national grouping has its own traditions and should be able to live by those traditions. But there are universal concepts here of human dignity, of the right of an individual to live a life that they choose without coercion from a dictatorial autocratic government, to insist that they worship in a certain way, to insist that they treat their bodies in certain ways, or to restrict their movements or freedoms. And we've seen Muslim societies, for instance, in Azerbaijan or Uzbekistan, develop democratic, free societies, which just proves that you, yes, can combine, as I used the example of Japan with its Eastern heritage and traditions. You can combine a traditional and even religious society with the principles of freedoms that we've delineated here in the modern age. And one of the points that Sharansky is making and made in his book is that we have not just the right, but the responsibility as a Western society, as a free society, to help promote those same freedoms elsewhere in the world. Now, that doesn't mean we have to take over militarily the rest of the world, but it does mean that we have a responsibility to use whatever leverage that we may have to promote those freedoms and real human rights, civil rights in those societies. Mr. Sharansky talks a great deal about this in his book also, because there's a principle behind this. It's not just altruism in terms of helping the people of a dictatorial society to break free of their autocratic rulers. It also serves to benefit the democracies of the world, because Andrei Sakharov used to say that democracies don't make war with other democracies. We've never seen a democracy go to war with another democracy. A free society where the leaders of that society are reliant on the people to be re-elected, whether they themselves or their parties or what have you, they then have a responsibility to provide benefits to that society. And we all know, in terms of modern warfare and modern economies, war is the worst thing for any society. It doesn't just engender death, but it can destroy whole economies, and certainly upends and disturbs the way of life of a society that's in war. I can tell you that as an Israeli, having been in all sorts of situations over the last 35 years of living here, of different battles and operations and even wartime in Israel. And of course we know that in the United States as well. So democracies where the leaders are dependent on the people, the leaders have to provide benefits to their people. They have to provide a growing economy, jobs, health benefits, and the kinds of infrastructure and policies and actions that actually benefit the society. And because of that, they don't go to war, even when there is great economic or social or political rivalries between countries. Germany and France, who were at war for 800 years, figured this out, and then as democracies since World War II, with all the economic rivalries and political rivalries that exist, have not gone to war over the Alsace-Lorraine industrial and agricultural kind of breadbasket of Europe for the last 75 years. There is a truth to this truism, which is so very basic to this discussion about how we define human rights and about why it is that it's important to recognize that we do have a right and a responsibility to promote those rights and freedoms in other societies without dictating changes to the cultural makeup of those societies. But it's not just that we have a right and a responsibility. We also have the ability to do so, to effect change of this sort. We saw that in the former Soviet Union. And it's worth taking a moment to remember what the Jackson-Vapnik Amendment meant back in 1976, if I remember correctly, and then afterwards in the early 80s with Ronald Reagan championing the same cause. The policies of the United States of America in the late 70s and early 80s under Jimmy Carter and then Ronald Reagan transformed into a new kind of political and economic pressure on the former Soviet Union. You may remember that there were issues of the SALT treaties, the SALT talks, in terms of arms reduction. There were issues of giving the Soviet Union most favored nation status, which was a very important status in terms of tariffs and trade relations. There was a very important issue at one point. There were wheat sales on the table to the former Soviet Union, which they desperately needed to provide food for their people. And what the American government did at the time, and most particularly under Ronald Reagan, but it was bipartisan, very important to recognize. Henry Scoop Jackson was a Democrat in the Senate, and Vapnik, I believe, was a Republican. And we saw this under Carter and then under Reagan, where a real bipartisan approach to this foreign policy issue came about, where the leverage that we had to bring to bear on the Soviet Union was used for the first time. Let me make this clear. What we're talking about is policies that were decided that were linked, and it's this linkage that's so important, linked to domestic policies of the Soviet Union. Meaning, the Jackson-Vapnik Amendment related to the Soviet Union agreeing to open up its very restrictive immigration policies so that Jews and others were going to be allowed to leave. Jews wanting to specifically make aliyah, to move to Israel, which was restricted for many, many years. And there's issues of the repression of the Jewish community over 70 years under the former Soviet Union. That's another topic itself, but it's actually related to the dictatorial nature of the autocratic regime, of course, of the communist regime of the former Soviet Union. But the issue was that the wheat sales and the most favored nation status and the progress in the arms talks were linked to a number of domestic reforms that were insisted upon by the American administration. Ronald Reagan said to the Russians, you need to allow an opposition newspaper to be published in order for us to move ahead with the arms control talks. You need to allow dissent to be expressed within your society in order for us to move ahead with the wheat sales. You want most favored nation status, then you need to allow freer emigration for Jews and others in your society. Now, that's what Andrei Sakharov, as the leader of the human rights movement, and Sharansky himself as the spokesman of that movement for Sakharov, meant when they talked about the importance of this kind of linkage. And that's what Mr. Sharansky refers to when he talks about this linkage in terms of not just the right and the responsibility, but the ability, the capability of Western nations to use the leverage that we have, economic, social, political, votes in the UN, it doesn't matter what it is, to help to encourage the regimes that are autocratic and dictatorial in the Middle East and elsewhere to open up their societies. Similarly, I was suggesting, I mentioned some of the names of people in the Middle East who are very much involved in fomenting a more open and tolerant society. I didn't mention a number of Palestinians who are my personal friends. Walid Salem, who's the head of the Community Development Corporation in Jerusalem. Rami Nasrallah, also in Jerusalem. Mohammed Dajani, who's the head, I think some of you have heard me speak about him before, the head of the Wasatiyah movement in Palestinian society, the middle-of-the-road, kind of tolerant, Muslim, theological, but very Western, cooperative and tolerant ideology called Wasatiyah. These are people, Mohammed Dajani, Hannah Senora is another one. These are the kind of people, and the other names that I mentioned earlier in Syria and Kuwait and Egypt, that we should be supporting financially, supporting rhetorically. One of my biggest criticisms of President Obama in the very beginning of his term, and the criticism of many of us, in the liberal world, but who recognize the importance of these issues of promoting human rights and freedoms around the world, was that he didn't give enough support to the burgeoning revolutionary movement towards freedom, the Green movement in Iran at the time, the very, very beginning of January 2019. It's one of the biggest criticisms I have of President Trump, that he doesn't focus or support enough the real freedom fighters, those who are really fighting for freedom, for rights, for democracy, for women's rights and gay rights and other minority rights in Arab and Muslim societies. That is an obligation and a responsibility and a right that we have in Western society that we should be much more vocal in pursuing. And the point of the Soviet Union example is that we have the ability to affect these kinds of change. Now, I don't know enough about the impact on Saudi Arabia of the new regime there and how much it is opening. I'm very afraid that many of the announced policy changes there are purely cosmetic, as we've seen across the Middle East when there is a supposed move towards more moderation, and then that has led to, unfortunately, real extremists ending up taking over either through a coup or through even a quasi-democratic process, which isn't democratic because it's not based on freedom of expression. This is one of the biggest issues we had with the Palestinians within the context of President Bush's push for elections in Palestinian society. Elections, as I helped Mr. Sharansky say in an op-ed once for the LA Times, elections do not a democracy make. Elections are a mechanism by which a democratic society elects, obviously, its representative leaders. But it has to take place, an election has to take place within the context of a cultural and social milieu where there is freedom of expression, where there's freedom of the press, where there's freedom of assembly, that people can gather together and read different kinds of media and have free debate of policy options. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case in Palestinian society. It's not the case in Egypt. It's not the case in Lebanon or Jordan, where, although Freedom House, as I mentioned, does list some of these countries as partially free, the reason it does list that is because they're not as not free. They're not as autocratic regimes as some of the worst on the face of the planet. Iran, Burma, China, Venezuela, and obviously Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and the others. I think what's important, and with this we can close the discussion. It's been a good hour, and I don't want to belabor the point about Israel and the Palestinians over much. I hope that this discussion has enabled us to give a little bit more thought to and a little bit more recognition to how important these definitions of human rights and freedoms are when we're having political discussions about where the responsibility lies when it comes to some of the conflicts in the Middle East. Because whether we're talking about Egypt and Syria and their domestic issues, or Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, or whether we're talking about the Arab-Israel conflict and the hostility of the Arabs towards Israel, there's no question that too frequently, college campuses or in the media or otherwise, as I've mentioned, the term human rights is bandied about and used to batter Israel, literally the only democracy in the Middle East, in a way that really doesn't apply within the context of the reality that's on the ground. And so I would hope, and I'd be delighted to take your questions. I'm sorry this isn't an interactive forum, but you're welcome to email me at rea.green, aryeh.green@gmail.com, or through, obviously, the staff at Smith Ranch. If you have any questions or you'd like to argue or explore any of these points more in detail. But I hope this has given a little bit of insight into some of the definitions that we talk about, and some of the ways that we can understand how some hope for real peace, which I'm happy to conclude with, really does exist when we look at the Middle East and the Arab-Israel conflict, because I truly believe that, as I mentioned earlier, quoting Sakharov and Sharansky, that if democracies don't make war with other democracies, then this means that if, and I'd say when, the Arab societies around Israel become democracies, become free societies, tolerant and open to free debate, and recognizing the issues that we take for granted, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, women's rights, and the like, that we will be able to come to terms with not just Israel's establishment and its legitimacy in terms of the people of Israel returning to our ancient homeland and reestablishing our sovereignty there and the justice of that cause, but also with that acceptance then opens up the possibility for Israel to move much more strongly to seek out ways that we can cooperate as we've always sought to with our neighbors, with the Palestinians and with the Arabs, and even lead to all sorts of creative possibilities when real peace is around the corner, when the Arab societies and the Muslim societies say, yes, not only do we accept Israel, but we believe in providing benefits to our own people. We believe, even in a Muslim tradition, that these freedoms are indeed universal. Then if that's the case, we may be able to pursue some ideas that today seem radical, like shared sovereignty over the territories that are in dispute, or some form of economic or even political union across the Levant. Really, the possibilities are endless when we understand what bringing real freedom and democracy to the Middle East, the benefits that would bring, and what the future really could look like. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope also to be able to have similar discussions in the future, hopefully in person, once we are able to come to terms with and have succeeded in battling this latest struggle that we're all in together with the coronavirus. Be well, be safe, stay safe, and as I like to say, stay sane. Thank you for joining me.